Hello and welcome to another update. In this one, I'll be covering the latest developments from the front line, starting out with some developments in the Clichka area, then moving on to Ukraine's main push in the Robotinner area, followed by some advancements by the Ukrainians by the Kamianka area, and then we go to the Staromyorsk area, and finally in the northern part where the Russians' offensive is continuing. And then we take some look at some further analysis of Ukraine's attempts at Russia's defensive lines and the actual defensive positions of the Russian forces. So starting out in the Clichka area, we see here that the Ukrainian forces have managed to advance a slight bit towards the area of Kurdyomivka. So essentially, with the Russians pouring a lot of reinforcements to Clichka, this could mean that the defenses at the other areas like Anderivka and Kurdyomivka may be weaker, or that generally it would be easier for the Ukrainian forces to push through these areas in comparison to Clichka. So essentially an attempt to go around Clichka rather than going through it, since the Russians have prepared a lot of defenses in the area. So far, they have managed to advance a bit by bit, and they are now close to the area of Kurdyomivka, as well as they have positions across the canal line, which indicates that they already have the necessary artillery to attack the village of Kurdyomivka. And since it is smaller than Clichka, then it is also, if the Ukrainians can gather in large enough force, they could have a better numerical advantage than fighting at Clichka, especially with the area closeness to Bakhmut for Clichka in comparison to Kurdyomivka. It is fairly isolated from larger areas, which would indicate less artillery on the Russian side and so on. So generally, the Ukrainians would have a better chance with Kurdyomivka than Clichka. Moving on, we have to take a look at the area of Robotinner, which is the central part of Ukraine's main push. However, I have an issue with calling this the main push, because although that is what the Washington Post or the New York Times actually announced, the issue with this is that it is not Ukraine's main push. It is essentially the first phase, the first part, but on a larger scale. They're using more armored vehicles, they're using more infantry, but this is not their main push. Essentially, if we take a look at the first part and then double it up, that is what this is. So it is the prelude to the main push. They are essentially tired of going at it for 2 months with almost no advancements. So they decided, okay, the reason we're not seeing advancements is because we're not using enough force, which was exactly what I said in this video here. And the Ukrainian forces have yet to reach the first line of defense, which begs to question, is it enough? No, it's not. They're not sending enough forces to actually reach the first line of defense. And with the current situation, the Russian minefields, air firepower superiority, their actual air force, there's a lot of factors we have to count in. And sending company-sized units out, essentially, well, this is the result. Capturing a couple of fields in a month's time. This is 10th, 14th, and 20th of July. To capture most of this field, it has taken many, many days. So it's a terrible strategy, I would say. And the Ukrainian generals took that personally. So what we're currently seeing is that the Ukrainian forces are using much more forces, which is why we are seeing these two advancements over the past 3 days. And we can see that the Ukrainian forces have reached the first parts of the defensive lines of the Russian forces. Taking a look at the map, we can see that what they have reached is the first anti-tank ditches of the Russian forces built here around the Robotinner area. So these black, red, and then there's the light red. So the black-red colors are infantry fortifications, trenches, and so on, while the light red are anti-tank ditches and the shark teeth and all the other things that are supposed to prevent the tanks. So there's this very long line of anti-tank trenches and so on from Vasilivka all the way to the east to Poluhi. There's a small gap, and then we follow all the way down to the Donetsk front. So essentially what we're seeing is that the Ukrainians are trying to push through at the Verbova area. And the reason for this is, if we take a look, the distance between the anti-tank ditches and the fortifications of the infantry is wider here than any other part of this front. So essentially this would be the best place to go through, as it would allow the Ukrainian forces to first bypass the anti-tank ditches and so on before attacking the Russian positions, and then they can push on to the next line. So what we are seeing is that the Ukrainian forces are trying to attack the Russians at the defense point where they are at their weakest, so that they can have the best possible chance at breaking through. At the same time, we also see some developments by the Lobkova area, where here the Ukrainian forces have captured about a larger part of the Russian positions by Kamianka, the southern part. We also see that there's a huge dash area here to the west, and if we look at the fortifications map, we also see that there's a lot of trenches here to the east of this area. There's a trench that goes to the northeastern edge of the dacha area, and then there is some here in the open fields to the north of Luhova. So essentially what the Russians are looking to gain here is to prevent the Ukrainians from advancing at this part. And then we're seeing that the Ukrainians are trying to push through again where the fortifications are weakest. If they go straight through Serebryanki, you can see that there is multiple layers of fortifications they have to go through. Go south of Piatkhatki, you can see that there are multiple layers of fortifications they have to go through. But if they go through the central part, they can essentially bypass if they use the armored vehicles and get around the fortifications, which would allow them to have an easier time pushing through them. So essentially what they're looking to do is attack from multiple directions against the same fortifications, which would in turn allow them to have a better chance at bypassing and going through these fortifications. But as we can see, there's a large concentration of Russian fortifications in this area, which is why it is so difficult for the Ukrainians to push through. The areas which they have captured are essentially without fortifications. As soon as they have reached these fortifications, their advancements have stalled so far. So again, they need further units and more firepower to actually break through these fortifications. Until then, the Russians seems to be holding on. And it is the same across whole front line. The areas where there's a lot of Russian fortifications, it is difficult to break through. They chose the area which has the least and most spread about. These are smaller rather than these larger ones that are connected. And these are more isolated, which allows the Ukrainian forces to go at them one by one. If you take a look at the map over here, we see that throughout 2 months of fighting, they've gone through them one by one. As we can see here, they first took the areas to the north. Then they moved eastwards, taking these areas. Then they moved southwards, taking these areas. Then they moved southeastwards, taking these. And now they've broken through this eastern part, and they're now fighting at these areas. Although large parts of this area is also in a gray zone, which indicates that the Ukrainians may and may not have full control over these areas. However, there's a lot of fighting by these trench networks, and the fact we saw the latest video with a lot of these trench networks essentially abandoned indicates that the Russians have withdrawn from these behind the first line of defense. The Ukrainians are reaching the first line of defense where the Russian forces are prepared there now. So if the Ukrainians are looking to break through the first line of defense with their main push, then this would be the time going through the Novodanilivka area and down south to the Verbova area, after which they can reach the second line of defense and try to break through that with their main push. Otherwise, they would have to essentially continue this small push by small push until they break through the first line, which could take a long time because the Russians would essentially focus their forces to this area if this is where the Ukrainians are pushing through. So if the Ukrainians want to use their first push, it has to be before the Russians relocate their forces to the areas which are weaker. Until then, they would have to essentially create multiple abilities, multiple areas, multiple possibilities for them to attack through, which if we take a look at the areas, we see Velika Novosilka and the Kamianka areas. They are both in these areas, both these areas, they are trying to create such possibilities. And if we take a look at the Bakhmut area, we see that there's a lot of fortifications here as well, but it is way beyond the Bakhmut area. So if the Ukrainians manage to encircle Bakhmut or take control over the supply lines, then they can essentially just push through. But we also see that north of Soledar, as I've mentioned multiple times, Soledar is essential for Ukraine to encircle Bakhmut. We also see here that there are fortifications built, which means that they would have difficulties pushing through this area. The best area to push through is the southern area, and as I've mentioned multiple times, the Sheivka is the one that holds the southern area, which is why the Russians are using everything they can to hold on to it. Otherwise, we see here that the only fortification is by Kamianka and Usarianivka. Other than that, there is just open fields, and the Ukrainians will have the high ground all the way through this whole area until they reach the fortifications. So unless the Russians start building fortifications by Upitna and Uperadivka by the highway, the Ukrainians will have an easy time going through the southern flank. So the Russians will have to here hold Clichka at all costs, otherwise it is essentially difficult for them to hold on to Bakhmut from the southern flank. Then we move on to the recent developments on the northern part, where the Russian forces have managed to capture this patch of forest line here to the southwest of Liman Pershi after they withdrew from it a while ago, and they have also managed to capture the final part of the borderlands between Luhansk and Donetsk in the southern part, as well as capture small territories here. This most likely is some fortifications that have been built here, otherwise it wouldn't be such a small area with a weird size. So most likely the Russian forces will try here to push through and gain more control over this area if there is some fortifications here that they've captured. Otherwise you would have to push through this forest line and move westwards and try to capture more parts, and then the open fields will come with it as they have control over the forest lines, which would give the best cover and the best ability to push through and consolidate their gains. So all in all, the developments are rapidly developing. There's a lot of changes every day. The front line moves, and the Ukrainian forces are putting more and more forces into their offensive, but the main push has yet to arrive. Something to notice about the Ukrainian offensive is that now they have used a strategy where they send a lot of infantry to the front, where they take control over the forest patches. They dismount from their vehicles and they take control over the forest patches. So this indicates that they may be preparing for their main push. If the Ukrainians send wave after wave of infantry in these forest patches, with time they will gain enough forces, enough numbers, and then they launch a massive armored assault. They'll have the infantry to go with them, and eventually they would have enough forces gathered around in these areas to make a large push. So as long as they keep increasing the amount of soldiers by the front located in these forest patches, in the trenches in this area, they would be able to consolidate this area and then push forward with an armored convoy. If they're able to go through this whole area with an armored convoy and launch and attack through here, they would be able to have much higher chance of success compared to having to go through this area as a gray zone. So the Russian forces are here being pressured in the sense that they have to attack the Ukrainian positions as they gain them and try to prevent any gathering of troops in these areas. But it is difficult because although they have a lot of drones to make reconnaissance in these areas, it's also difficult to locate infantry in these forest patches, as they can have camouflage, they can hide in foxholes, and all of these things that makes it difficult for these drones to actually detect them, especially in summer where the trees are the fullest, which allows for the least possible amount of view. If there's raining, then it is also impossible to use these drones. So generally, in rainy days, that is when the Ukrainians move the most equipment to prepare for their offensives. And in the last 24 hours, there's been rain, which indicates that we will most likely see another push for the Ukrainians very soon, as they've had their chance to move their equipment through this rain, which disallowed Russian drones from being used to locate them beforehand. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.